You're watching Northern Crimes.
Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, October 1994. A lone hunter makes his way through a remote wooded area just southwest of the city. He's walked this land many times before, but today, something stops him in his tracks. Amid the fallen leaves and undergrowth, something pale stands out against the earth. It's a human skull, partially exposed. What began as a routine hunting trip quickly became a crime scene. Authorities arrived, and within days, they uncovered more remains. The discoveries raised urgent questions. Who were these victims? How had they ended up in this isolated place? And most chilling of all, how long had their killer been lurking in the shadows? Little did the investigators know, they were about to unearth one of the darkest chapters in Saskatchewan's history. This is Northern Crimes. In the early 1990s, Saskatoon was a city on edge. For years, Indigenous women had been disappearing, their cases often dismissed or overlooked. Families had reported their loved ones missing, but answers were scarce. Many of these women were young. They were daughters, sisters, mothers. They had dreams and lives of their own. Among them was 16-year-old Shelley Napope, a teenager from the Duck Lake area. Described as outgoing and full of life, she had dreams of becoming a teacher. But in 1992, she vanished after last being seen in downtown Saskatoon. Eva Taysup, 30, was a mother of 4 from the Yellow Quill First Nation. Her family described her as fun-loving and fiercely protective of her children. She disappeared in 1992 without a trace. Calinda Waterhen, 22, was known for her kindness and love for her family. She'd been struggling with difficult circumstances, but was working toward a better future. She too vanished in 1992, her fate unknown. For over 2 years, their families waited in agony, hoping for answers, but with little media attention and no significant leads, their cases remained open and unsolved. Then, the gruesome discovery in 1994 would finally force authorities to take a closer look. Who was behind these deaths, and how many more victims might be out there? When forensic anthropologists examined the remains found in the wooded area, they confirmed the worst fears of the families who'd been searching for their missing loved ones. The bodies were identified as Napope, Taysup, and Waterhen. The trio of women had been missing for years, their fates unknown until now. With the confirmation that these were homicide victims, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, launched an expansive investigation. They scoured missing persons reports, re-interviewed witnesses, and pieced together the final known moments of these women's lives. As detectives worked the case, disturbing patterns began to emerge. The victims shared commonalities beyond their tragic ends. They were all Indigenous women. They all vanished from the same city, and their bodies were all found discarded in the same remote location. The similarities were too striking to ignore. Investigators turned to local police records, hoping for a breakthrough, and that's when a name started appearing again and again. one that sent a chill through the law enforcement community: John Martin Crawford. Crawford was a man with a history of violence. His name was tied to past crimes, some of them disturbingly similar to these murders. As detectives continued combing through the old records, John Martin Crawford's name appeared with disturbing frequency, and what they uncovered about his past was even more chilling. In 1981, at just 19 years old, Crawford had been convicted of manslaughter for the brutal killing of 35-year-old Mary Jane Sirloin in Lethbridge, Alberta. Her body had been found mutilated, bearing bite marks that matched Crawford's teeth. Originally charged with first-degree murder, he took a plea deal and was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but served only 7 before being released in 1989. Authorities now suspected that Crawford had resumed his crimes almost immediately after his release. The timeline of his movements aligned perfectly with the disappearances of Napope, Taysup, and Waterhen. But they needed more than suspicion. They needed undeniable proof. Police put Crawford under intense surveillance, watching his every move. It was during this period that they witnessed a shocking event, one that would later be cited as a devastating failure of the justice system. One night, Crawford picked up a woman named Teresa Camacho. Like many of his previous victims, she was an Indigenous woman living in Saskatoon. Crawford had a pattern. He targeted women who were vulnerable, women society had already overlooked. Under police watch, Crawford drove Camacho to a secluded area, and there, inside his car, he violently assaulted her, leaving her bruised, bloodied, and barely able to move. When he was finished, he abandoned her on the street, and what happened next defied all logic. Instead of going after Crawford, the man with a known violent history who had just been witnessed assaulting a woman, the police arrested Camacho. Why? Because she was intoxicated. Despite having just seen the attack, officers claimed she was disruptive and booked her instead of the man who'd brutalized her. Meanwhile, Crawford drove away without any consequence. It was a devastating failure of justice. A man suspected in multiple disappearances had just been handed a free pass, and for at least one more year, he would remain a free man until police could finally gather enough evidence to bring him down. In spite of the setback, detectives pressed on. They gathered witness statements, including testimony from a former associate of Crawford's who had first-hand knowledge of his crimes. The final piece of evidence came from forensic specialists. DNA and other physical evidence tied Crawford to the murders. There was no doubt he was responsible. In January 1995, police arrested Crawford and charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder. In 1996, after years of uncertainty for the victims' families, John Martin Crawford stood trial in a Saskatoon courtroom. It was a case that many believed should have come to light sooner, but now, at last, the full scope of his crimes would finally be revealed. The prosecution laid out a chilling case, detailing how Crawford had lured his victims, subjected them to horrific crimes, and discarded their remains in the remote wooded area. Forensic evidence, witness testimony, and chilling confessions all pointed to one undeniable truth. Crawford was a predator who'd been hunting Indigenous women in Saskatchewan for years. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from a man named Bill Corrigan, a former associate of Crawford's who had first-hand knowledge of his crimes. On the witness stand, Corrigan recounted in disturbing detail how Crawford had targeted vulnerable women, coaxed them into his vehicle, and later bragged about what he'd done. Prosecutors played taped conversations between Crawford and Corrigan that had been secretly recorded during the investigation. On these tapes, Crawford was heard speaking with casual indifference about the crimes, showing no remorse for the women he'd killed.
I remember thinking, she's only worth $50.
He was recorded saying about one of his victims. When he took another woman's life, he reportedly thought,
Fuck, here goes another one.
The courtroom fell silent as the full extent of Crawford's depravity became clear. For the families of Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Calinda Waterhen, the trial was a devastating ordeal. They'd spent years searching for answers, only to discover their daughters, sisters, and mothers had suffered unthinkable violence at the hands of a man who saw them as disposable. At several points during the trial, family members left the courtroom in tears as the details of their loved ones' final moments were recounted. The emotional weight of the proceedings was unbearable. Still, they remained determined to see justice served. The defense, meanwhile, offered little argument in Crawford's favor. His lawyers didn't bother to present a case for his innocence, nor did they attempt to refute the overwhelming evidence against him. Instead, they attempted to paint Crawford as mentally unstable, suggesting that his years of substance abuse and a difficult upbringing had shaped him into what he'd become. But the jury wasn't swayed by these excuses. After weeks of testimony and forensic evidence, the case went to deliberate, and it didn't take long. On the day of the verdict, the courtroom was filled with families, journalists, and Indigenous activists who'd long fought for justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women. At last, the decision was read. Guilty. 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 Crawford was convicted of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. The judge, in delivering his sentencing, didn't hold back. He described Crawford as a remorseless predator who'd targeted these women he believed no one would miss.
These young women had lives. They had families. They had dreams. You took that away from them without a second thought.
Crawford was sentenced to 3 concurrent life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. Yet, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, Crawford showed no remorse. When the verdict was read, he sat motionless, his expression blank, offering no reaction to the reality that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for the victims' families, justice felt incomplete. They'd fought for years to have their loved ones' disappearances taken seriously. They'd been ignored, dismissed, and even blamed. Now, as Crawford was led out of the courtroom in shackles, they were left to wonder, how many more women had suffered the same fate, forgotten, dismissed, erased, before their bodies were ever found? The Saskatchewan Murders are more than just a horrifying true crime case. They reflect a broader issue that continues to this day. The women who fell victim to John Martin Crawford were not nameless or forgotten by their families. They were loved, they had hopes and dreams, but they were preyed upon by a man who saw them as disposable. Crawford was caught and convicted, and in 2020, he died in prison. But many still ask, how many more women suffered the same fate, never to be found? And how many other cases like this have been overlooked simply because the victims were Indigenous? The Saskatchewan Murders serve as a haunting reminder that justice is not always blind, and that for some, it comes far too late. But the bigger question remains. How many more predators like John Martin Crawford have gone unnoticed, simply because their victims were women that society ignored?